everyone, Stormy Strike here, and welcome to my annual surprise speculation video for the BreyerFest Gambler's Choice model, this year's 2025 Seize the Day surprise. The only thing we know about this model is that it will be the typical surprise model price of $85 and the same number made as last year, which is $7,800. General disclaimer before I go any further, I do not work for Breyer. I do not actually know what the surprise model is. While the surprise model mold usually ends up being somewhere on my top 10 list of guesses, I can of course never guarantee that I will guess it right or will even be close to guessing it right. This video is for the fun of guessing and entertainment purposes. I base a lot of my guesses and speculation on public knowledge of past BreyerFests and Breyer releases. I look for patterns and determine what I think would generally make sense for Breyer to pick. That being said, Breyer can pick whatever they want for the surprise model, and while we as pattern-seeking creatures hunt for patterns and have noticed some over the years, that doesn't mean Breyer is going to be staying true to them. Breyer can technically do whatever they want. They could really surprise us and release a completely brand new mold through the surprise model, which I do not think that is very likely, but it's always a fun idea. It's possible that Breyer may even intentionally break previous patterns that us hobbyists have pointed out over the years, just to keep us on our toes. Last year, the surprise model did break a previous sort of pattern, in fact, which was in regard to the surprise model pose. Prior to 2024, all the surprise model molds were in some kind of action pose, which I did think was maybe kind of intentional to make the surprise model feel more exciting. But the 2024 BreyerFest surprise was the Emerson mold, a standing thoroughbred. This year, I will not be surprised if we see the surprise model break another pattern, and perhaps an even much bigger pattern. Before I can talk about breaking patterns though, I need to go over the patterns that I take into consideration with my guesses. First up, I'm going to list the patterns or rules that I think are extremely unlikely to ever be broken. The rules that I think will always be true and why. First, the surprise model will never be a mold that's already been a BreyerFest surprise model. That's kind of a given, I feel like. Breyer just has such a huge category of molds to choose from that using the same mold twice would just not really make any sense. Secondly, the surprise mold will probably never be a mold that is a current BreyerFest special run, and probably also not a current BreyerFest limited edition or celebration model. I feel like there is more leeway when it comes to special limited prize models, like the Best Customs Contest prize model and the Open Show prize models. Those I feel like they can maybe get away with doing possibly the same mold for the surprise. Still not likely though, and I would not really count on that happening. The reason we probably won't see a repeat of the same mold for the same BreyerFest is Breyer wants to sell lots of models, and part of doing that is giving a variety of different models and molds that are going to appeal to different people. Using the same mold for two different releases at the same BreyerFest, again, just kind of doesn't really make sense to do. Thirdly, the surprise mold will probably never be a very unpopular mold. This is kind of for the same reason as above, that Breyer wants to sell lots of models, and they make a lot of the surprise models. They make more surprise models than any of the other special runs. If they made it on a very unpopular mold that hardly anyone wants to buy, or that people are going to be really upset about if they already bought it, then that is really just not going to go over well. They are going to want to use something that is at least generally well liked by the hobby to maybe even being very popular. Lastly, number 4, unless hobby opinions drastically change, we can expect the surprise model to be a traditional scale model. Traditional is just one of the most popular scales, and so they're going to want to stick to what is most popular. Now, while that was the list of kind of more hard and fast rules about the surprise model, there are a bunch of other patterns, and these are the ones that I think are up for possibly being broken at one time or another. So the surprise is usually not used as a previous year BreyerFest model. That includes like special run, limited edition or store special, celebration model, and so on. I think this rule has actually even been broken already before with a model. I think it was with the Roxy model that she was the volunteer model for BreyerFest the previous year. I do still highly doubt that they would use the same BreyerFest Special Run model again, and probably the Celebration model, but I feel like limited edition is a little bit more susceptible to being broken. The Surprise model usually has a recent but not too recent release on the mold. The time frame of this is usually about 6 months to 2 or 3 years. The mold often does coincide with the BreyerFest theme in some way. It hasn't always been the case, but usually when BreyerFest has a kind of specific theme going on, the mold does reflect that in some way. Unfortunately, with this year's theme, anything can go, so that doesn't really help this year. The Surprise Model mold has so far always been at least 3 years old, and it has also not been a mold that is over 20 years. So far, 16 has actually been the oldest. I say 20 years because 20 years is the mark of when something becomes vintage. Therefore, I would say they usually don't go with a vintage mold. So far, the Surprise model has always been one model and not a set of models, and the Surprise model has also never been a very small traditional scale mold. For example, it's never been like a really small pony mold. So far, the smallest mold that has been used has been Flash. The Surprise is usually not the same breed or breed type as the Surprise from the previous year. The mold is usually a dynamic pose, but as I mentioned earlier, based on last year, that is definitely not always the case. The Surprise mold is also usually a different pose than the mold from the previous year. For example, there's usually not like 2 trotting molds 2 times in a row. Again, I will not be too surprised if the Surprise this year does end up breaking one of these patterns, and with that in mind, I did not eliminate some molds I would have normally not taken into consideration for the Surprise this year. Which brings me to mold eliminations. In order for me to really examine the molds that I think are good possibilities, I first go through and eliminate the molds that aren't good possibilities. I'm not going to go in depth on the eliminations this year and each molds that weren't eliminated from it. Instead, I'm just going to show them all on screen. And in short, I put red X's on the molds that break patterns from the first list I showed. I put yellow X's on recent 2025 releases, and gray X's on ones that aren't a good choice based on the second list of patterns. However, I did decide to also add these kind of greenish, yellowish boxes around some molds that I think could break a pattern in a big way, specifically having been a BreyerFest model last year. So here's the slideshow basically of all the molds and how I ended up marking them. Shout out to identifyyourbreyer.com, as they are where I like to grab screenshots of all the various molds together. I don't think I'll really end up using any visuals from the website BreyerRef in this video, but also shout out to BreyerHorseRef.com, as I did use that resource for more behind-the-scenes aspect in working on my top 10 list. After molds have been eliminated, this is the list I have afterwards. There are a lot of molds on here, and you'll notice that I did highlight some molds. I highlighted molds that I think are potential big pattern breakers for being used as BreyerFest models last year in yellow, and then molds highlighted in gray are also potential pattern breakers for being older molds that are 30 plus years old. Let's actually go ahead and talk about these. Normally, these much older models would be ruled out on the first big round of eliminating molds, but since it's the BreyerFest 75th anniversary, and that is the theme of BreyerFest, a vintage mold feels more possible to be used this year than in previous years. I've also been seeing a lot of people guessing vintage molds for the Surprise, so I decided to include some of the more popular ones in a large list of possibilities here. I'm sorry to say, vintage mold fans, but I don't think we're actually going to see any of these molds used. Yes, there is a higher likelihood of them being used than previous years, but like it usually goes with the Surprise, I don't think we will realistically see a mold that's older than the 1990s be used. But I did want to include some older molds for fun in like this vintage mold sublist here. I do also want to say, I'm sorry, I did not include Sherman Morgan on this list. I know a lot of people have been guessing him, but I just really cannot see that happening at all. I know he got mentioned in a BreyerFest blog post, which was really interesting, but I just really do not see him as being that popular or beloved of a mold with the hobby in general. And so I have just a really hard time seeing Breyer use him, because I do think he would be one of those models where maybe like at least half the collectors that would get the surprise model would be very disappointed. Of this list, I think the ones that are most possible to be used would be Lady Phase and Pam, maybe also Sham and the semi-rearing Mustang, but I don't have as strong feelings about those ones. Lady Phase seems to be pretty well liked still, even with younger collectors in the hobby, and she is not as old as some of the others. I picked Pam as well because she is also a pretty popular mold, and one that seems like maybe for contract reasons, Breyer can only use her sometimes. I've heard only like little tidbits here and there about that situation, so I don't know what it is exactly. Don't ask me, I don't know. I've just heard that there's kind of a reason why we only see her at BreyerFest in the Vintage Club and not as a regular run. But my thought is if Breyer did want to do a fairly big release of her without her being a regular run, then what other fun way to do it than being a special run again and being the surprise model? Of course, I have to mention that there is a different version of her that got shrunk as a stablemate this year too, which could go either way on whether that makes her seem more or less likely to be used. Maybe more likely in that Breyer is thinking of this mold, but less likely in that they already have a release that was kind of like a big draw for the Stablemates Club, and they might not want to downplay that in any way, if that makes sense. Taking out all of the molds that were made before the 90s puts the list like this, and then now it's actually time for me to narrow it down further into my honorable mentions and top 10 list of guesses. I know I usually say this every year, I think, but narrowing down my top 10 and honorable mentions list this year was really tough. It actually wasn't too hard for me to pick my top 4 guesses, but after that it got a lot more difficult to decide, and the order to rank these models also got really difficult. In fact, I kept changing the order of these models very frequently while working on this video. When deciding this list, it really ended up coming down to me thinking about mold popularity. Because this is a big special anniversary year, I think they might go for a pretty widely loved mold choice. Plus, in recent years, I have noticed like the level of popularity for some molds kind of changes every other year, or at least popular based on what I observe from the hobby via social media. But for example, 2020, 2022, and 2024 all had molds that I'd say are generally really well liked, but they weren't ones that people go absolutely crazy for. Like in 2021 and 2023 especially. So I'm expecting that they'll pick a mold that gets that kind of level of excitement from people, or close to it. Without further ado, let's go on to the list, starting with an honorable mention, Othello. This will be the oldest mold that I'm putting on the list, which is at 26 years old now. That is 10 years older than the oldest mold that has been used as a surprise. But this mold is extremely popular, which I think a mold being very popular could throw out reasons it might not normally be used. Furthermore, this mold's popularity was tested recently at BreyerFest 2023 when it sold out very fast as a limited edition, and then again it was used in 2024 as a collector club model, which I believe also sold out pretty quickly. I should note though that the stablemate version of this mold has already been used twice this year as a stablemate club model and a regular run. I really don't know if Breyer takes the stablemate versions of molds into account, but if they do, then maybe he's being used too often this year. It should also be noted that this model was a treasure hunt model before, which is debatable if a model that was used as a treasure hunt event, or even just some other kind of wider gambler's choice release of 4 colors or more, for example, like the Christmas Day model. That is something I can't help but wonder if Breyer considers for when picking the surprise model, if they look at the previous releases on that mold and go, oh, we already did a gambler's choice release of this model, so we don't want to do another one, sort of thing. So this mold kind of has several different things that are against it for being the surprise model. But again, very popular, and I think popularity could beat out everything else when it comes to using a surprise model mold. Next honorable mention is Goffert. This guy is the second oldest mold on the list, coming in at 20 years. Now he was used as a BreyerFest model in 2024, but as a open show prize model, which I think is maybe a little less of a huge deal for Breyer to use again as a special run the following year. I feel like this mold is fairly popular, even though it hasn't had a more widespread release in a while. There are two main reasons why I keep considering this mold, which are the fact that he was used as the BreyerFest 30th anniversary celebration model, which would make using him for this anniversary year a kind of fun callback, and secondly, his breed or original breed type. Frisians are a very flashy kind of breed, almost mythical and eye-catching, which is probably why they are one of the breeds that get used a lot in things like movies. I just kind of personally have an association with them that they are this type of horse that is really fitting for big events and celebrations, and therefore maybe fitting for a Breyer anniversary year. And one more honorable mention for the Marwari. I know I did a third honorable mention and I usually only do two, but there were just so many mold possibilities this year, and a lot of them were worth talking about, and so I just had to do another. Like Goffert, the Marwari model was a prize model for BreyerFest last year, but again, I don't think that would stop Breyer from using it. My main concerns about this mold being used are about popularity and the fact that this breed is rather niche compared to a lot of the other molds that are on this list. I'd say that this is a generally well-liked mold, or at least the original Marwari version of it is. The other version of it with the normal ears and fluffy mane and tail seems to be a lot less favored by collectors. I even have to agree that I like the original version of this mold the most. If Breyer threw in both variations of the mold into being the surprise, I could see the reception being kind of mixed. Now for the actual top 10 list. Number 10 being the gaming stock horse, or Wyatt. I've had this model on my list of surprise guesses several times now. I'm honestly not feeling too strongly about it this year though, which is why it is at number 10. It is a rather popular model and in a pretty exciting pose. Yet I almost feel like its popularity has maybe waned a little bit in recent years. I feel like it would be fairly on par in popularity with like Emerson last year. That being a popular and well-liked mold, but not the kind of mold that we have that moment of the hobby collectively exploding because Breyer used it kind of thing. That's of course not to say that this mold doesn't have its fans, but I could see the hobby freaking out a lot more over other molds further up on this list. Number 9, Trotting Arabian Mare, aka Weather Girl. If this mold was used, she would not break any previous patterns, but as to note, like with Othello, she was a treasure hunt model in the past. Again, Breyer may not consider that sort of thing at all when picking which mold they want to use. We really don't know, but it is worth mentioning. I feel like this mold is pretty popular still. She does have the issue of tipping easily, and I know that is something that some collectors don't like and therefore won't collect her because of. That same sort of thing can be said with molds with stands. I know some people don't like to collect models that have stands either. I can't help but wonder if a model's tippiness, or if them having stands, is something that Breyer may or may not consider when picking the surprise. And I bring that up because that is going to be talked about even more further up this list. Regardless, she is a mold that I do feel like I could see a lot of people getting excited over if she was the surprise. Therefore, I put her as number 9 on the list. Number 8, Shagia Arabian, or Yasmin. This is again a mold that I think is generally well liked. I don't feel like I see a whole lot of people go crazy for it, but it seems like collectors like it. To me, it feels like a kind of very safe option that Breyer could pick for the surprise model. Again, a lot of people like it. I imagine if Breyer used it, it wouldn't get too much in the way of complaints. There is the slight concerning factor that it hasn't been used since BreyerFest 2023. That does not put it out of the realm of possibility. It really is just more common for the surprise model to have had a release the previous year. Number 7, Totalis. This is a mold I'd say is regarded as rather popular. He has a flashy pose, and he was recently released as a regular run last year. There are two things about him that made me hesitate with putting him any higher. First being his stand. While we have seen one surprise model have a stand so far, it was the large plastic stand that a model inserts into. whereas this one is a small clear plastic stand that does often break in a model's hoof a lot. He could still be used. It's not like they haven't used this mold and others similar to him as special runs before, but I can't help but wonder if that would be a factor against this mold. The other thing is that this mold is a warm blood, and last year's surprise model was also a warm blood. However, this type of warm blood is at least kind of different. This is a dressage eventing type warm blood versus the build of a racing thoroughbred, so I think it is different enough that it could still be picked. Number 6, Vallegro. Vallegro here is a lot like Totalis, another warm blood, but of the dressage and eventing type variety, so he could probably be seen as different enough from last year's model. Vallegro also has a stand, but this one is a large plastic kind of stand that I think people generally have a lot less issues with using compared to the little plastic discs. And so that is one of the reasons I put him above Totalis in the list. I also put him higher up because I think he might be slightly more popular. It's hard to say, as both these molds are dressage horses by the same sculptor, and people seem to generally really like both of them. But I feel like Vallegro is the one that I see people get a little bit more excited about whenever Breyer does a new release on him. I could pretty easily see him being a surprise model. Number 5, Animar. When this guy was first released in the Premier Club, he had a pretty mixed response, with a lot of people actually really not liking him. However, it seems general opinion of this mold has shifted, and he's become a lot more popular. He's actually the youngest mold on my list of guesses at 3 years, which does give the question of whether Breyer saw that he was becoming more popular or not before deciding on the surprise model for 2025. Since the BreyerFest models are usually planned out in like a year in advance, I don't know if they would have kind of seen that shift, that this would become a rather popular mold. Aside from his popularity maybe being questionable, there is not really too much else that I can think of that would make him less likely to be the surprise, and he would also not break any previous patterns. I think he would be a really fun one to see a lot of various colors on if he was the surprise. And now for my top 4 guesses, which I especially kept changing the order of around, literally right up to recording this video, and I bet even afterwards I'm going to want to change it again. But I've been changing the order of them like crazy, so kind of take the order with a grain of salt. But here's what I decided to go with. Number 4, the Shire Gelding or Shenandoah. This is a very popular mold, and that alone I think makes him a great possibility for being the surprise. Additionally, he does not have anything that would necessarily make him a pattern breaker. There's a couple small things that make me question him though. One that wouldn't break previous patterns, but is more just a little unusual, kind of like with Yasmin, which is that he hasn't been used since 2023 for the BreyerFest Special Run Wells. Again, it is just more common for the Special Run mold to be used the year before or have a regular run that is still in production than it is for it to have not been used for 2 to 3 years. It's not unheard of, so I don't think that would rule him out at all. The other little possible issue is that this mold can be prone to tipping problems sometimes, kind of like Weather Girl, but not nearly as bad, which ended up being the main reason I decided to put him in at number 4 and not higher, even though initially I was thinking of putting him even higher up on this list. One last thing to note on him is that he does have 2 different mane and tail options, which would make for some additional added fun and variations. He's actually, I think, the only mold on this list, aside from the Marwari, that has different hair possibilities. Number 3, Vermeer, or the Frisian Sport Horse. This is a pretty popular mold. I'm at least assuming he is pretty popular. I feel like I see a lot of people who really like him, and his past releases of Battlefield Angel and Surratt seem to have been very popular. Despite being 5 years old now and rather popular, he actually has not had that many releases, so this could be a good opportunity for him to be used. I think I might have had him on my list of surprise guesses before. If he was used, he would not be breaking any previous patterns. He seems like a good candidate to be used as a surprise model in general, in my opinion. And as I brought up with Goffert earlier, I do feel like the Frisian breed, even though this guy's technically more supposed to be a cross, I do feel like they have a very grandiose vibe to them that I think would just be a nice fit for anniversaries and big celebrations. Number 2, Troubadour, the Morgan Stallion. Ever since this mold was released, I think it's gotten a pretty high amount of love. There is nothing about this mold that would cause it to break any previous patterns. I think he is just a very good candidate overall. Kind of like Yasmin, I think he would be a kind of safe choice for Breyer to go with, just because of how generally liked overall he is. But I'd consider him a lot more popular, and one that more people would freak out about if he was the surprise compared to Yasmin, which is why he is so high up on this list. He just overall seems very well suited to be a surprise model. And now on to my number 1 guess, Mustang Stallion, aka Fireheart. I know this mold has been used as a BreyerFest model last year as the traditional scale online only limited edition, and I know that Breyer has been using him quite a lot ever since he was first released. But if there is a mold that's going to break a fairly big pattern, I think it's probably going to be this guy because he is very, very popular. And Breyer surely knows at this point how popular he is. I'm sure they have sold boatloads of Mojave since he was released in 2023. This is the kind of mold that would gain a lot of excitement from a lot of hobbyists if it was the surprise, and probably also a lot of crying because I know a lot of people conga this mold. An additional point I realized too is that the Marin Full molds that were released to kind of go with him, sort of, as like a set, they are also special runs this year, so I don't see it out of the realm of possibility for them to have Fireheart as the surprise so that they were both in the same lineup of special runs. I could also see them having like a few particular colors that would go well with that Marin Full special run. One slight concern I do have, besides the obvious fact that he was a BreyerFest model last year, is that he is being used as a 2025 stablemate. And again, as I mentioned already twice, I don't know if the stablemate versions of the same molds really affect their choice to use a mold or not. It could not. I have no idea. When it comes down to it, the main reason I picked Fireheart as my number 1 is because of mold popularity. He is on par with, or maybe even more popular than Hamilton. I know in these videos I used to say that the surprise model was usually a popular but not too popular mold, but I think them using Dundee and especially Hamilton in recent years has shown that I don't think that is true anymore. So there's my list of honorable mentions and top 10 guesses. As I often do, I may give an update to my list shortly before BreyerFest in the form of either a post or a short video, if there are any Breyer releases between now and then that significantly change my list, but for now, there it is. Let's talk a little about color variations. I'm sure the color variations will be much like how they have done in the past several years, with there being 5, 6, or maybe even 7 different color variations. But lately, 6 has been what is typical now. And I want to mention, because I think I have heard a couple people say that they were guessing that the surprise would all be decorator colors, and I highly, highly doubt that, because there are too many people that don't collect decorators. If the surprise was all decorators, a lot of people would be really unhappy. I personally absolutely love decorators, but I know there's a lot of hobbyists that really mostly collect realistic models, so they would not be as excited. I am expecting there to be 1 or maybe 2 decorators in the surprise model color variations, and I bet the decorator will somehow relate to the 75th anniversary theme by being either a throwback vintage color or something flashy like a diamond or gemstone kind of color. But I talked quite a bit about my ideas for decorator 75th anniversary variations in my video talking about all the BreyerFest models though, so if you want to hear me talk more about that, go check out that video. It's always hard to say what we might see in the way of realistic colors. We'll probably, like usual, see a solid color, Appaloosa, and Pinto. Sometimes they don't throw in an Appaloosa though. It does seem like they don't really repeat the exact colors for the surprise model from the previous year. So if we look at the surprise model colors from last year, I'd say we probably won't see any that match these colors really closely. For example, I don't expect there to be a solid cremello or a chestnut sabino and so on. Of course, they may still do like the same kind of coat color, but probably change it up somehow to make it different. For example, they may still do a chestnut, but they might make it a Appaloosa chestnut instead of a Sabino, or it could be just a totally different shade of chestnut, that kind of thing. Before I go, I'm going to be wrapping up with some personal thoughts. I'm personally hoping that the surprise model will be a mold that I like, but that I'm not maybe too crazy about collecting a lot of models of. That way I can be content with just having like one or two of them. That's honestly how I've felt about the past two surprise models. There's been like 2 colors of each of those that I'd like to have in my collection maybe, but I'm not compelled at all to like try and track most or all 6 colors down. I am planning on getting only one BreyerFest ticket this year and having one of my special run picks be a surprise model, which is partly why I hope the surprise model mold falls into that like, I'll maybe want my 2 favorite variations but not want to buy a bunch of them. Of my top 10 and honorable mentions list, the Marwari, Wyatt, Yasmin, Totalis, Vallegro, and Troubadour are all ones where I'd probably be cool with just wanting a couple. Fireheart I actually wouldn't really want any of unless maybe there was a cool decorator variation that I really liked. Othello, Goffert, Shenandoah, and Vermeer would probably have me in a lot more trouble because I like all of those molds quite a lot. I could see there being a lot of colors done on them that would make me want them. And then lastly, Animar is one I would be in very big trouble with because I am really loving that mold. I only have 2 models on it so far, but it seems like a mold I could easily want to collect many more of. When it comes to surprise models, sometimes I want to hope that it will be something that I love because it's exciting and cool to see one of your favorite molds be in so many different colors. But then I'm also usually rather relieved when it is a mold that I don't really collect many models of, or maybe don't collect any models of. That way I don't have to worry about the money and space needed to acquire them. Before I give out the closing video question, one last personal thing, which is an update to my status of going to BreyerFest or not. I am sadly not planning on going in person. I would love to go in person, of course, but there's just too much uncertain things going on right now. I have a lot I'm trying to get done in my personal life. I have a different vacation planned somewhat around the time of BreyerFest, and I don't think I have the mental capacity to plan for 2 different big trips right now. I'm hoping that maybe next year, 2026, will be the year. If not, then 2027. I really do hope to go back some year sooner than later, but it will largely depend on my life situations, so it is just impossible for me to say right now. Whenever I am able to go back, I will probably be bringing my fiancé with me at least, which should be a really fun and interesting experience. Lastly, before you go, let me know in the comments what you think the surprise model will be. Whether you are planning to attend BreyerFest online or in person, I hope you have a great time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye everyone!